Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal, democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. Tonight's program explores the powerful theatrical imagination of playwright Adrienne Kennedy, who turned 92 last month. A new volume in the Library of America series presents for the first time a collected edition of her writings spanning 6 decades, including uncollected and previously unpublished works. Along with her plays, the volume gathers her fiction and extraordinary memoir, which, like the plays, have a vividness and almost hallucinatory intensity. The volume is edited by Marc Robinson, who joins us tonight. Adrienne Kennedy Collected Plays and Other Writings is published with support from Meryl Streep and from an anonymous donor. Thanks to their generosity, the volume will stand as a lasting testimony to Kennedy's achievement, and our producers will drop a link to the book in the chat. Information on supporting or permanently endowing volumes in the Library of America series can be found at loa.org/support. Special thanks to our promotional partners for this program: the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, the Dramatists Guild of America, and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. Adrienne Kennedy has been a force on the American stage for over 60 years, from the premiere of her groundbreaking Obie Award-winning play, Funnyhouse of the Negro in 1964, to her long overdue Broadway debut last year with Ohio State Murders. Her haunting plays transform the stage into a state of mind, a dreamscape, actors into ghosts, and personal history into myth. Actor Natalie Portman has said, "Kennedy never takes a straight path from one event to another if a more beautiful route is available." And Henry Louis Gates has written, "People will be reading Adrienne Kennedy's works for centuries to come." Joining LOA Live to explore the beauty and power of Kennedy's writing is a very distinguished panel. Margo Jefferson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, has served as book and arts critic for Newsweek and the New York Times, and is currently professor of writing at Columbia University. Her books include On Michael Jackson and 2 acclaimed memoirs, Negroland, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography, and Constructing a Nervous System. She joins us from Manhattan. Branden Jacobs-Jenkins plays, including Appropriate and An Octoroon, winner of the 2014 Obie Award for Best New American Play, and the Pulitzer Prize nominees Gloria and Everybody. His TV credits include consulting producer on the HBO series Watchmen and showrunner, executive producer, and writer for FX's Kindred, adapted from Octavia Butler's novel, which is collected in the Library of America. Butler edition, I should say, is the subject of a previous LOA Live conversation where Branden and I talked about the novel and about the process of adapting it for TV. He serves as vice president of the Dramatists Guild Council and professor of practice at Yale University. He joins us from his studio at the Park Avenue Armory. Marc Robinson, editor of this Library of America edition and moderator of tonight's conversation, is Malcolm G. Chase 56 Professor of Theater and Performance Studies and English at Yale University. His many books include The American Play, 1787 to 2000, and The Other American Drama. He joins us from his office in New Haven. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome our moderator, Marc Robinson.
Thank you so much, Max. It's such an honor to be here to celebrate a writer who has affected generations of spectators and readers of drama, memoir, and fiction, among other forms, and to do that celebrating in the company of two writers who are themselves indispensable writers of drama and memoir. So thank you so much, Margo and Branden, for joining me to talk about Adrienne Kennedy. A quick note about the format for our conversation. I'm going to raise 2 or 3 general topics to start us off. And then after we talk about them, we thought we'd each read briefly from her works and comment on those selections. And then we'll go back to a few more specific questions before we open it up to questions from the viewers. And also, while I'm officially the moderator, Branden and Margo, please feel free to ask questions of one another yourselves.
And of you.
And of me. So I thought I would begin with just your origin stories, your first encounters with Kennedy's work, either on the stage or on the page, if you can recall them. What was the piece that first made you aware of Kennedy's writing? And perhaps you could describe its effect on you. Margo, maybe we can start with you.
I will begin. 1964, I am a senior in high school in Chicago, and I am very interested in theater. I don't think about being a playwright, but of course I think about being an actress. You know, Diana Sand, Gloria Foster, they're there. I read theater magazines and I read reviews of plays, and suddenly this title and this woman, Funnyhouse of a Negro by Adrienne Kennedy, seized hold of me. It was partly the boldness of the title, Negro and Funnyhouse, and that sense of something that was non-naturalistic, but also insistent. You know, you won't. In that way, she had the kind of effect that Baldwin, whom we were starting to read in those years, did too. It was, you can't escape, but she has so many methods. So I got a hold of, I guess it would it have been a Samuel French copy of that play, and I read it regularly, certainly every year, partly to test myself. Was I getting it? Was I finding more in it? And also as the civil rights movement was moving into Black Power, you know, so many things tracked. I was so moved and liberated in a way by that just claiming of multiple selves and, you know, of psychic anguish, and always though with the lucidity. I saw every production I could at places like, you know, public theater, etc. But I must say, I always found reading her particularly exciting because she was so clearly, you know, a major literary artist with these webs of imagery and metaphor, and the rhythms and the use of repetition and variation and thematic subtlety, but also boldness. I did think of her as much a poet as well. There are of course poetic playwrights, but I was also reading by the late '60s Sylvia Plath, and they seemed to me to have a real connection, which was.
I definitely want to draw you out as we go on about the Plath affinity between Kennedy. I remember in your book, Negro Land, you called Funnyhouse a demand for freedom, I think was the phrase you used, as, you know, as forceful as the Civil Rights Act was that year.
Yeah, I guess I did. A demand for emotional, for psychological, for narrative, speaking it aloud and descriptive freedom, that kind of unafraid. There was so much decorum, which you see in Negro Sarah. Also, I want to be as pallid as possible. There was so much decorum surrounding young Black women, all Black women who wanted, particularly if they wanted to be artists or intellectuals in some way. And she had all that complexity, but she just broke through the pieties, really like no one else had.
Yeah, yeah. Branden?
Well, similarly, but maybe with the distance of a generation or so.
Or so.
Yeah, or so. I mean, I like most people, probably in my cohort, encountered Adrienne in an academic context, and and it was Funnyhouse of a Negro. It was this title that kind of sang out from the table of contents, and seemed to be gesturing in a way towards like a performance of race or performativity of race that at the time I was sort of lacking in my seeking out role models or beacons or thematic anchors in my formation as a writer, because I was at that time, it was the living August Wilson was casting this long shadow, and in any kind of conversation about like Black artists in the theater, the kind of dominant mode in conversation was about realism, naturalism. And as a student of writing, I was gravitating towards people like Sam Shepard and sort of the strange, but also feeling an interesting absence of Blackness inside those conversations about the avant-garde. And she emerged very quickly as a kind of cross point in the academy and sort of the archive. And it was actually it wasn't until I took a class with the amazing scholar Daphne Brooks, and your colleague and mine, Mark, in her African-American drama class as an undergraduate, that I finally read the play. And it's so interesting to hear you, Margo, talk about this compulsion to return to it, because it does have the effect of like a puzzle box, I think, on a certain kind of young mind, that it feels in a way that certain kind of high modernist texts do, that you're supposed to kind of return to it so that it reveals the secret it's obviously holding. And I would say I must have written like 5 papers on that play over the course of my like academic life. And then once I began to sort of, she even says that, to her dismay, most people think that's the best play she's written, but you know what I mean? But actually the irony of her work is that it's been very difficult to find. I mean, this is why the volume is such a triumph, because, if you wanted to do a deep dive into Kennedy, which I did, you had to seek out the like out of print editions of Cities and Physique in some library and get the interloan. If she felt like one of those people you had to pass around. I remember one of my former mentors handing me a photocopy of a Beast story, and that was the only way that I could read that. But at some point I discovered the Alexander plays, which to me are kind of the crown jewel of her project as a writer, technically as a writer, and those are the plays I've returned to again and again, over more so than even Funnyhouse. But that's been sort of my safe home, or the Alexander plays, historically, until this edition. Well, now I'm obsessed with different stuff, but I guess that's what we'll talk about.
Yeah, I love the image of the, Xeroxes of her work handed around from reader to reader for so many years. That's how so many of us kept ourselves going with our Adrienne Kennedy fixes that we
and waiting for these volumes to come out.
Yeah, totally.
In one act. Okay.
Yeah.
Triplets. All right.
Yeah. Thank you. I thought I'd move us out now from the specific to the general, and maybe ask you each about your sense of Kennedy's overall achievement over the 60 plus years that she's been writing. She has experimented in so many different genres and forms, as this volume
within
shows.
the same work. There's weapons between from work to work.
Yeah, I mean, I was, just trying to list some of them, chamber theater, poetic theater, documentary drama, a kind of protest theater in some works, musicals, children's theater, adaptations, and equally various in prose forms. So I wonder if I could ask you, is there a kind of a Kennedy signature that you can see despite that plurality of formal
One thing,
experimentation.
Branden, you said she's a high modernist, in every way, aesthetically experimenting all the time, wanting always to break through to, falsehoods and truths that have been somewhat buried, but never simple truths, always ambiguities, ambivalences, pauses. Her engagement also, which I think of as, it's postmodern too, the open engagement with multiple texts. She's always in conversation, which I find so fascinating, because it's also so much what creative nonfiction is claiming for itself now. This almost appropriation and reportage about other writers. And there's Adrienne and her prose meeting Virgil. There's Adrienne, meeting a song lyric. There's Adrienne with the Psalms, and I find that wonderfully brave. I keep saying brave. I find it wonderfully pleasing and exhilarating, because it's very sensually appealing, but it always sets off other intellectual connections for you.
Wow.
And multiple rhythms are going off in your head too.
Yeah, I would say, the thing I always say about Adrienne is she's actually kind of the elder statesman of the American theater, of that. And this is indebted to a lot of the amazing scholarship you did, Marc, but like the tradition of American dramatic writing moves through kind of the off Broadway space. Honestly, if you look for any connection between what's happening now and did you lose my audio? Am I still here? Okay.
Oh, you're here.
I forgot to hit do not disturb on my computer. Anyway, but if that she is that really the kind of trend of American drama moves through the off Broadway movement, and that everyone writing today is ultimately writing under that star sign. And she and John Guare are the two remaining kind of major figures alive from that era, now that Albie's dead, Shepard's dead, Fornes died, and that's kind of tremendous to like really think about for a second, that a Black woman is sort of the last man standing in some ways. I would say in terms of why she's groundbreaking in that context is I think she was really the major voice that carved out a kind of formal space for thinking through Black identity on a stage, or any kind of identity on a stage, right? That she's
and female identity too.
Yes, exactly. But there was a kind of liberation from the tyranny of having to make sense, in a traditional way.
Yes.
And I think that we live in this space where intersectionality is like a key, buzzword, but she was really stumbling on that formally, right? This idea that like I shouldn't feel this obligation to explain myself in a way that feels tidy and neat, because in some ways what she's talking through is how racism is its own kind of tyranny, that ultimately racism is an attack on the interior, and that the only way to expose that wound is to somehow make the interior visible. And I think she really did that work more so than anyone, and she did it in kind of unprogrammatic way. I think the person she's read against often is Amiri Baraka, but you have to think about Miri's work in the context of what he's doing politically, whereas she's really in a way that is an amazing tradition. I mean, it's amazing you bring up Plath. I think of like Alice Munro. I think of Gertrude Stein. Like she has to
Clarice Lispector.
Totally, exactly. Or like Lenore Carrington. There's something happening where her work has to work on the scale of the individual, because her subject position is somehow without a home in a grander kind of political landscape or something. Does that make sense? That's the gift of what I think she gives, and she lays the ground for someone like definitely Susan Lori Parks, but I always say that like that kind of there's a kind of strong strain of the avant-garde that moves through the kind of flowering of American writing, but also Black American writing, that she sort of is one of the gateways for. Yes. I would say.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
I'm just my head is exploding with this wonderful new kind of school.
Also, I think you may have been maybe you weren't any more liberated with August Wilson dominating the landscape, but for my generation, and there Baraka was not helpful. Feeling you had license to the creative right and license to not justify that you were obsessed with Thomas Hardy, you know, or
Right.
we're quoting from Virgil every morning.
Right.
So that's huge, and we're still learning from that she
Yeah.
exist. You know,
Yeah, she kind of talked pretty fearlessly.
the appetite, you know, for every aspect of culture.
Yeah, she does something that's, I mean, she talks about the entanglements of whiteness, right? In a way that doesn't simplify, you know, and in some ways, every subject is waging war for culture. That, you know, that
That's
she
right.
wants to, her characters want to own their Shakespeare in there, but they feel this conflict in the ownership. And that's, to me, a very true, you know, a true statement of what actually it is to be a reader and a thinker and a writer and a maker.
That opening, the opening of Funnyhouse, you know, where there's the Duchess, there's Victoria, and then, you know, and here I am, you know.
Yes,
I'm still thinking of a you know, an anthology that includes Kennedy, Alice Munro, Clarice Lispector, Lenore Carrington, and Sylvia Plath. What an amazing, or a course, what an amazing seminar that would be. We've already touched a bit on.
You know what? Maybe not. There's some of Gwendolyn Brooks's poetry I wouldn't include, but the Aeneid, I would, or the Aeneid, we'll call it. You know, it's so diving into you know, language as, you know, a forest, you know, and a sort of underground treasure trove. It's wild. So I might include that. Yeah. Not Martha, which is, I love it, but it's another thing. But
yeah.
Do that anthology, Mark.
Branden, you had mentioned, you know, her connection to a writer like Susan Laurie Parks. I'm wondering if you could say more about her broader influence on, you know, the current generation of younger writers, what her legacy is, where you see her presence in the theater.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel it. You know, I think that any kind of like conversations around Blackness and formalism, you have to think about her. I mean, obviously, I feel deeply influenced by her. I think Susan Laurie would also confess that she's pulling from her in a major way, because it was about a liberation of formal constraint. It's like, I'm going to let the content dictate the form. And I see that. I mean, I guess you asked me to like name check people, but I feel guilty because I haven't fact checked this. No. Yeah, but you know what it is that she really, to me, embodies what we would call like the downtown aesthetic in some ways. And you see her interlocutors in someone like Richard Foreman. You see it in like Young Jean Lee is someone I think about is working in that space. There's a lot of, you know, any kind of play now where there's a writer who like comes out on stage as a writer and talks about their writing. It feels like we're dealing with actually Tennessee Williams as filtered through Adrienne, right? That she was trying to seek out a way to make the space convincingly autobiographical, but also inside that autobiography, leave room for abstraction, you know? But, you know, I feel like everyone's, also, Adrienne was a great teacher who taught almost everywhere. And it's that thing where a teacher is, you know, she's taught major critics who've now going to be critics, you know, the way that whatever she's imparted to the generation is like on a molecular level. You know, I don't think anyone is running around trying to exactly recreate what she's done. But even in this sort of last wave, there's been a spate of plays about kind of, you know, ethnic identity and not mental illness, but you know, how the pressures of identity can lead to mental, you know, fragmentation. That's all her to me, you know, whenever I see those plays.
Yeah, you know, her play Bronte Scenes, which is in the new collection, a previously unpublished play that's about her. I mean, it's set with her at Harvard during one of the semesters she was teaching there, and her undergraduates that semester are characters in the play who merge into being members of the Bronte family. It's really quite amazing short play. And I'm glad you mentioned Tennessee Williams, who, as we know, was so hugely important for Adrienne, and seeing Glass Menagerie when she was 16 is what set her on the path to writing. And of course, that is the play where the author is present as much as the others in his family.
And like Adrienne, going to the movies.
Exactly.
Movies,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we can go to some selections from the plays or prose that each of you have wanted to have flagged and wanted to read to us and maybe comment on tonight. Margo, maybe we can.
Oh, I was gesturing towards Branden because we've been talking so much about, I'm reading from from the memoirs, but he's really, I think, reading from, an astonishing play.
Okay.
I'm very tempted to chicken out here, so I might need some encouragement.
Don't do it. Oh.
I wanted to read from this play Boats, which was like one of your amazing discoveries, Mark, which has never been printed before, and it's 2 pages, and it's like this wild thing, and I'm just living in fear that I'm not going to do it justice, but I'm happy to try it, and then you just have to stop me if it's like truly going off the rails.
Oh, go.
But it's such a crazy play. I just wanted to read talk about Boats. Negro woman sitting by the canal. Beyond the canal is a row of white houses, one house distinct. She is drawing. Sky, grass, bluebells beside the canal. A yellow sun explodes. Water in the canal moves upstream. Yellow and white boat comes downstream. She draws the boats. She says, at this canal we met here at Little Venice on a day when the boats were yellow and suns exploded. I'll do this for stage directions. Down the canal comes a red sailboat. Inside is a blonde young man. He says, I have my ear. The important thing is how we feel about each other. But we met when the boats were yellow and blood poured out of a passing fragmented moon. The red boat sails away. A large fragmented moon appears. Blood pours out of the fragmented moon and the moon vanishes. She says, we met in London. You look like my cousin who shot himself in the ear. Orange sun bright. He was an American Negro, yet he looked identical to you who are English, yellow sun. At the canal we met when the boats were yellow and blood poured out of a passing moon. 3 white boats move upstream. The boats stop. You begged me to stop speaking in abstractions and to stop drawing abstractions. You said there could be hope for us if I could stop abstracting. You said you were English and suns exploded and blood will not stop pouring. He comes again down the canal in a black barge that passes white boats. He says, you must forget places and remember only how we feel about each other. You must forget about the relationship of orange, sun, yellow. I have my ear. The important thing is how we feel about each other, but we met when the boats were yellow and blood poured out of a passing fragmented moon. He goes off, white boats still. She says, and out of the passing moon, you were not my cousin who shot off his ear, that the important thing was how we felt about each other. A red sun revolves. A red sun revolved, and I must forget about things being identical and forget about America where my cousin shot himself. A figure climbs up the front of the house beyond the canal. In England, where you were born, places, I must forget places, and that figure climbing on the house beyond the canal, and remember only how we felt about each other. The red sun revolves closer. I must forget about the relationship of orange sun, yellow, and a new imbalance of red suns revolving closer. A pale green boat goes upstream. She draws. The figure climbs up the front of the house. A blue boat appears inside the blonde young man. As the boat comes closer, she looks up at the red sun. The figure still climbs up the house. The blue boat and the blonde Englishman are before her. He has great blue eyes. He stands up in the boat, holds out his hand across the railing. He says, again on Primrose Hill, you told me I was identical to your cousin who shot off his ear and who looks identical to me, although I am English and he was American and black, and I am English and white, yet we both were identical, you said. She looks up at the sun. Orange sun passes across a new sun. She says, closer orange sun across a new sun vanishes. He says, I begged you to stop speaking in abstraction. If you could stop speaking and drawing, there would be hope, but you cannot. He sits down in the boat and disappears down the canal, The figure climbs on the house. She gazes at the sun. She says quite sadly, vanishes yet spins mysteriously before me. The water in the canal moves downstream. A yellow and white boat passes. Red barge goes upstream. New sun, then appears spinning mysteriously. And isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I guess I don't know what to say except that there's something about her use of abstraction, and actually her, you know, one of her great signatures is her manipulation of repetition and how it does sort of build these like strange internal structures and logics to things. They have this sort of fugue-like energy to them that hint at memory and hint at the way, you know, neurosis seems to be a great kind of color in her toolbox. It sort of hints at, it kind of creates an energy around of what feels like a memory. It feels like a kind of buried love story. It feels like a breakup. It just kind of this strange word and image object that pulses with mystery that you find kind of compelling, almost like a foreign song, you know, you were like a catchy foreign sort of piece of music or something. And I just was like kind of taken away.
It's like
yes. And I think about it, and one of my favorite kind of the real rereads in this was Cities in Physique, which to me, it feels like the kind of, she's reached this, in this phase, I feel like she's clearly been conducting this investigation into like the potentials of abstraction in theater images, you know, and it feels amazing to feel her exercising these muscles inside of this kind of room that you feel that she's going to kind of abandon soon if you kind of read on, you know. And it just is something about the miniature of this that feels so epic that I just, you know, sign of a good play to me is that I want to see it, you know, and I feel like I ended this wanting to see it. But.
Good. There's something so heartbreaking about that line at the end of the play too, that you read where, you know, he says, I begged you to stop speaking in abstractions, but you would not.
Yeah. And she kind of has to. He said, I think he said, stop writing. He said, stop speaking and drawing. There would be hope.
Yeah.
You know, but she can't turn away from it.
In play after play, that moment where someone says, if you would stop, you know.
Yeah. Right. You think you're looking at a Joan Crawford movie or whatever, or Betty Davis movie. That's like the genius of a movie star, which is also my other favorite play. I have so many favorite plays.
Yeah.
Thank you, Branden. That's a play, by the way, from 1969, I believe. So Margo, over to you.
All right. I am going to read just some small sections from this uncanny memoir, People Who Led to My Plays. Adrienne's work, it turns out, has also been, I think I did say this quickly, but I'll elaborate a bit more, really ahead of all those curves that creative nonfiction, speculative nonfiction, even autofiction, you know, which can call itself a combination of the writers, the truths, facts, realities of a writer's life and persona, and wholly invented ones. And you know, these Elizabeth Hardwick's were writing some of that too. But these memoirists are working with these combinations. Fiction writers are working with these combinations, and Adrienne has been doing this. Certainly since she started publishing more and more essays, which was, I think, in the 80s. Yeah, exactly. So People Who Led to My Plays, with the deceptively simple title, is its memoir as portrait of the artist as a young woman. It's memoir as a kind of scrapbook. There are pictures, illustrations of everything from the Pied Piper of Hamelin to his Sidney Poitier to et cetera, et cetera. And it's it also shows in as much of her work does, it shows, you know, the thought, the precision, what she refers to really as mathematical. A great story is mathematical in descending from all the objects and people and forces of your childhood. So, it's strange, it's interestingly pedagogical as well as lyrical. And it has real connections to the particular Ohio State murders, with that beginning. Here she begins by saying, more often as my plays are performed, people ask why I write as I do and who influenced me. When they ask this, they're usually referring to my original one-act plays. After I attempt to answer, naming this playwright or that one, as time progresses, I realize I must go back far to the beginning. So I decided to move to the ominousness of Ohio State murders, and it's Suzanne Alexander, an alter ego, giving a lecture and saying, I've been asked to explain the source of the violent imagery in my plays. This is from 1987. So I decided to. People on old maid cards, 1936, age 5. Through make-believe, one could control people on a small scale. Paper dolls. You could invent enchantment with paper. The Bluebird, 1940 movie. Somewhere, if I could find them, there were some steps, meaning mini steps, that led to the Bluebird of happiness. But I would have to climb them, and they sort of sat there in the middle of the sky. It would be worth it, though. I wonder if they were in another city. What city? At the very end of this book, she climbs the steps to Circle in the Square Theater, where Funnyhouse of the Negro will make its appearance in the off-Broadway canon. All right, let me be sure I'm cutting to the right. Okay, 17, yes, forgive me, I'm almost here. Yes, all right. Snow White, the movie, age 8. I thought after seeing that movie that somehow, in some way, we were all sleeping and had to be awakened before we could really live. Pinocchio. If you lied, something happened inside your body that made you change, and people saw it. It didn't have to be a nose. Judy Garland. When she sang Dear Mr. Gable, I knew someone beside myself, someone else was full of yearning, just like myself. Snow White. I often thought, why did Snow White's stepmother want her killed in the woods and to have her heart brought back to her in a box? To be the fairest in the kingdom must be very important. It seems so simple and straightforward, and it just resonates throughout the work. And even the beginning of Funnyhouse, all those descriptions of the monstrous grades of whiteness and fabrics, and so it's very interesting. All right, just a few more.
And I should probably limit you just to one more. I'm just aware
One
of
more, you'll get that.
We want to save time for the questions from the other.
All right. Okay. Beethoven and Hatshepsut. I'd often stare at the statue of Beethoven I kept on the left-hand side of my desk. I felt it contained a secret, that's in quotes. I'd do the same with the photograph of Queen Hatshepsut that was on the wall. I did not then understand that I felt torn between these forces of my ancestry, European and African, a fact that would one day explode in my work. I'm sorry, one more. She's talking of how Picasso had inspired her, but when she's in Africa, I brought a great African mask from a vendor on the streets of Accra of a woman with a bird flying through her forehead. That's when I could totally break from realistic looking characters. I would soon create a character with a shattered, bludgeoned head. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just so beautiful to hear those words again. And I very much like what you said, Margo, about how she kind of transforms the memoir form. It's, you can read through that whole book and it's actually, I mean, her friendships and family are obviously there, but it's not really about intimacies among people. It's intimacies with art.
Exactly. This
Yeah.
the sheet music, the movie, her mother's cabinet, or her
Right.
mother as an aesthetic object.
Yes. Yeah.
And her father.
Yeah.
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 It also brings to mind your question too, Mark, about her influence. I realize that a lot of it is that she also presages postmodernism in the sense that she's kind of acknowledging the influence of pop culture on
Yes.
self-formation in a way that I
Yes.
think no one else was really doing.
I think that's
at the
right,
time.
because
Yeah.
with no condescension, with no self-consciousness, and that's what
Mhm.
so many people were stuck inside.
Mhm.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, had we time, I would want us to talk more about her relationship with the movies generally.
And with popular songs too.
And songs for sure. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Especially June and Jean in concert, that play, which is just, you know, full of songs from the 40s.
Yeah.
But
clearly, the movies is one reason we all love. A movie star has to star in black and white.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's this this combination of romanticism in her work when it comes to the movies or some of those songs, but also something that's much sharper and edgier.
It's spookier.
Yes.
Yeah. And how she's able to get those to work together in her works, doing justice to both the romance and the whatever the opposite of that is.
Embodying it and analyzing it. I actually taught that play as an experimental essay, and it is partly that you feel, this sensibility, working and reworking, examining, and moving from mode to mode.
Yeah. Maybe the last thing I'll ask before we open it up is, and for Branden, maybe you can take this one on about, her plays in the theater. What particular kind of challenges does she set for directors, designers, actors who try to bring these pages to life?
Totally. I mean, she's operating in this mode, we use this phrasing over to theater of images, right? That she actually wasn't particularly invested in sort of naturalistic, kind of Stanislavski-based performance styles. But if you realize she's actually kind of her, consciously or not, her like instincts for collage are to me kind of the dominating genius of what she's doing. So an artist has to have a capacity to build these images and honor them. It's almost like she's working sometimes in this like tableau vivant tradition that occasionally talks. And I think you can't try to make too much Chekhovian or like Ibsenian sense of how things are moving, right? It's really about an encounter with images. And what happens actually is that as her work progresses, she allows a narrator to help guide you through this sort of succession of images. That's why Ohio State Murders is its own kind. I have some thoughts about that revival, which I was so happy to see on Broadway, but I was like, man, they really did not do the play. But because I think there's a reason why the characters are two different people in the play, but whatever. I think that what's interesting in productions I've seen a couple of different productions of Funnyhouse, and it's interesting to feel that play fight against too many production values, right? I feel like the most polished productions I've seen of that play have been the hardest to really grasp, because in some ways she was building towards, truly in an avant-garde way, she was building towards smaller houses. She was building towards intimacy. She was scaling to real confrontation. And I think the farther away you let that audience sit, the harder it is to feel consumed by the imaginative work that she's doing, I think, and there is a real interest in, the language is so, in some ways it's not naturalistic, but it is naturalistic. But you're like, I think about, we were talking about the Diary of Lights, which is like an amazing discovery for me, but that is not a naturalistic play. And yet you have to hold certain naturalism at moments and then do direct address, and you're all dancing together. And there's a kind of like, it demands so much of an actor. It's not just about character. It's about, she's interested in literally dance. She's interested in choreography. She's interested in bodies moving through space. And again, creating sort of mise en scène, everything is sort of a piece of an arrangement, and that's just one of the hardest things I think people to grasp often.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you say about intimacy with her work. And, the unproduced play Cities in Bezique, Gerald Friedman, her longtime collaborator as a director, didn't direct it, but he said if it were to be done, he'd want a single spectator in the theater wearing headphones, hearing the text and looking at images. That's the best way he thought for it to be done.
Where does she say my plays are meant to be states of mind?
It's like a note in the first University of Minnesota collection of her plays. Yeah.
Okay, so there, actor, deal with that. Yes.
Yeah.
Is this a good place to? Okay, this is a great conversation, I have to say. So we have some questions from the viewers. This one's interesting. It kind of relates in a way to Branden's reading from Boats. Ellen Diamond asks, I've written on and taught Adrienne's work for years, but never been satisfied with my thinking on her use of twins or deadly triplets. Instability of the self, repetition of the self, it seems simple. The twins, June and Jean, are introduced on page 6 of people who led to my plays. She says she was fascinated. How do you think about this, her fascination with twins and triplets?
I mean, it's rooted for me in sort of consciously or not in this idea of the uncanny. I mean, that's sort of, twins are the greatest challenge to or subversion of an idea of single self, right? That's located in a body. And so much of what she's doing is about displacing an individual on stage. I mean, Funnyhouse is about how everyone is Sarah on stage, and a movie like Movie Star is somehow about like the body of the narrator, but also it's how she speaks through the movie stars. So I think the twins is just kind of an extension of the kind of game, the bigger game she's playing around where to locate the self, where to locate an I subject, And again, and Ella on the Upper West Side, there's a kind of funny, she does start to have this motif of doubles that she plays throughout the end.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and my audio cut out midway through the question, so I hope this wasn't mentioned, that Kennedy once wrote in a letter, I believe, that she doesn't know who the person is who wrote her plays, that she doubles herself, becomes the reader of the work that some other person wrote at times. So I think it's, deeply bred into her identity as an artist.
And the way she uses them, it complicates and forbids us to do the sort of binary oppositions of the double, the white, the black, the healthy, the mad. She's always doubles and triples, and even the triplets. It's not just a double. There's always at least another entity in those works. Anyway, enough. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Okay, Elise Singer writes, I love Branden's phrase, the pulsing image object. Has Adrienne spoken of Beckett as an influence? If so, any specific elements or text? Let me just say that there are a number of questions on this question of influence, like where does she come from? It's like, and I'll just say that Shang Liu of Peekskill, New York asks, what inspired her? Deborah Jones of Palmer, Alaska asks, is James Baldwin's work an inspiration?
Yeah,
and
it is.
Roderick Williams from Pittsburgh asks about that too, about Albee and Williams and the other play that she mentioned. So I guess we could just bundle all those and just get your sense of
read people who led to my plays, and
that's the answer. Yeah.
Really, quite a list of them. Mark, does she talk much about Beckett?
I don't think she does, actually. I mean, obviously, Kennedy knew his work, saw those plays when they were first done, read them all. But I don't think she's written explicitly about his importance to her, although for sure the connections are there to be found. But Kennedy has been an omnivorous reader, spectator, listener. That play Diary of Lights is about going into the culture and reading everything and going to a Picasso show at MoMA and going to hear Mabel Mercer and Dizzy Gillespie.
reading Wagner's librettos.
Exactly. So the question of influence is just like, you know, it's kaleidoscopic.
Yeah.
There's
Yes,
nothing that isn't
that's a good word.
influence.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll say to the Beckett point, you know, I think he was the weather at this time, right? He, you know, she mentions, we know that Albee is a major kind of early supporter, and the Zoo story was what everyone was ultimately trying to emulate. But the Zoo story premiered on a double bill with the Beckett play. Like he was, you know, he was just the thing everyone was
Ubiquitous.
responding to on some level. Yeah. So the answer is probably yes, but whether or not she's consciously drawing on him or responding to him, I'm not totally sure.
Avidly. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's an essay in the volume actually that I'd recommend called Paragraphs, Passages, and Pages That Changed My Life. And it's a kind of continuation of people who led to my plays, getting at some of the same questions.
But it's so funny, this question haunts her, and it's in the work that everyone always wants to understand who influenced you. But in some ways, the work says everyone and no one, right? Because the story of her career is how this kind of almost sui generis kind of groundbreaking work emerged from this stew of self that she spent so long trying to analyze and describe. And it's just funny that somehow the need to give her influence is a thing that, you know, that's why I love for me, the joke of Ohio State murders is like, you know, you want to know why my work's so weird? Well, my life is weird.
Yeah, hello.
You know, yeah, my work's violent because I've experienced violence. That's sort of the game with her. Yeah.
And the thing about Funnyhouse of a Negro is that she arrived at Albee's workshop with that play completed, you know.
In a suitcase, that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Great. So there are a couple questions that ask about politics, I guess I would say, broadly speaking. One is, viewer says, my name is David Gammons. I studied with Adrienne at Harvard in 1991, the year her son Adam was assaulted by police. I am sitting in rehearsal at Virginia Tech where I teach with the cast of Sleep Deprivation Chamber. We open in 2 weeks. Thoughts about that play and the current social justice movements. And while you're sitting with that, let me just, because there's another question from Seth Gators from Wilmington, North Carolina, who says, can you speak to resistance in the Black literary tradition? I mean, I think what the question's asking in a way is, you know, Kennedy's plays are highly political, you know, but not in the way one usually, you know, not in the way one usually thinks. I mean, she's obviously related to, you know, Black art, but not like Baraka. I mean, there's just an interesting. So I guess maybe if each of you could just talk about how that works, you know, how the plays can be so intensely political and address Mr. Gammon's question about the deprivation chamber, but yet ways in which they're not like what we think of as political plays, something like that.
Well, in Sleep Deprivation Chamber, for example, the horror, which is very, you know, obsessively documented, the horror of that is also, there's another kind of playwright who would excise the mother's anxiety about, you know, we're very respectable people. You know, I'm well bred. Why is this happening to me? That, you know, that's not considered politically correct. But that's right there as part of the anguish that's going along with the larger. And that is something she always does. You know, there's you know, there's pure anger, there's pure grief as emotions that are you know, politically deployed, but never a pure set of circumstances or a set of motives for a character. I would, by the way, also recommend Black Children's Day. Is that what it's called? I think that's
wild.
Yeah.
I was going to cite that as well, and also An Evening with Dead Essex. I think that what it is, and I love Sleep Deprivation. It's like one of my favorite plays. I said that about every play I brought up, actually. I'm like, it's my favorite play, but it's so true. But you know, I think what it is that she has a real primacy that she places on experience. meaning that the works are not agitprop in the sense that she's asking us to take this and go somewhere, but for some reason it's like the theater or the literary space for her is about the depositing of experience for safekeeping. So you think about Dead Essex, and it's really, to me, about the struggle of trying to make anything about something that is that, by the way, is lost to oblivion. You know, I had to Google who Essex was, you know, but this play becomes the kind of time capsule that holds that for when it's needed next, you know, because it trusts that the literary object travels through time and finds the reader that it needs. You know, Black Children's Day is spectacular because it's insanity, but when you leave it, you're like, oh, right, what she's talking about is the density of space. That this house,
every insane moment is a part of
exactly
documentable American history.
Yes, and that's experience, that's sort of like the archive, that's the story. We talk about the archive, that she's ultimately saying that experience has to be a part of the things we collect to get to address the problem. And that's what I feel in Sleep Deprivation Chamber, is it's literally, and by the way, this thing predates so much of the, I mean, it felt so crazy to encounter that again in the last 5 years, that play, but you know, it really is about, like, she's not saying that we're going to change politics. She's like, you have to understand the ripples, the effective ripples of a practice like this. You know, you have to see where the pain begins, ends, and lives. You know, that's really the purpose of the display to me.
And
you
the
know,
damage that survives, the damage.
Yeah. I kept thinking about the Susan Laurie Parks line from Death of the Last Black Man, where she says, like, you have to write it down and put it under a rock, or else they're going to say it didn't happen. You know, I think that's sort of a bit of the documentary impulse I feel in some of her work, and why it's so valued, why it's been so valued for generations. You know, she's sort of speaking the unspeakable.
And yes, and as with you know, reading her and thinking you're going to come out with one message, you are also being challenged to get more complicated, to think more fully, to take in you know, all of the ugliness and you know, sickness of the culture and how it names not groups and selves.
The only thing I'd add is that I think the politics are also there and resonant in a different way, even in some of her most abstract works. You know, Sun, this poetic play that's
Malcolm X,
really hard to understand, but it's, you know, it's dedicated to Malcolm X. And Cities in Bezique, which Branden had mentioned, where she's at her most collage-like. That's a play that's occasioned by the assassination of Martin Luther King and by the Vietnam War. And once you know that, things kind of fall into place with that play.
And so these are all forms, I would say, of resistance to simplicity, to smugness, to settling for the easiest, even when it's honorable.
I think it's probably the perfect place to end. At 7 o'clock. Thank you very much for really, really deep and fascinating conversation. You've been listening to Margo Jefferson, Branden Jacobs-Jenkins, and Marc Robinson discuss the theatrical genius of Adrienne Kennedy. Her collected plays and other writings, edited by Marc Robinson, has just been published in Library of America, volume number 372 in the series. Please join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Wednesday, November 8th, LOA Live welcomes New Yorker staff writer Merve Emre, literary critic and University of California professor Adam Bradley, and WashU professor of English and African American Studies, William Maxwell, for a conversation about the Black literary expatriate scene in Europe and the brilliant and explosive novel set there, The Man Who Cried I Am, by John A. Williams, a lost classic of 1960s African American fiction, just out in a new paperback from Library of America, with an introduction by Merve Emre and a foreword by Ishmael Reed. Details about this and other upcoming Library of America LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Adrienne Kennedy volume and The Man Who Cried I Am, and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Margo Jefferson, Branden Jacobs-Jenkins, and Marc Robinson for a really wonderful evening. And everyone have a great evening.